The Washington Post describes her latest book, Small Great Things, as the most important novel Jodi Picoult has ever written. SBF is honored to have her here as our closing headline author. Join me in welcoming Jodi Picoult to the Savannah Book Festival.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Hello, Savannah! It is an honor to be here batting cleanup. And considering that I live in New Hampshire, my only question is, why did I not move here? I am really happy to be here with all of you today, particularly because this is the only event that I am actually doing to promote the paperback version of Small Great Things, which I'm going to talk a lot about, and which you guys, if you choose to purchase it, will be getting before anyone else in the world, because it's not available until Tuesday. So feel special, feel very special. But I'm actually going to start off by talking a little bit about how I got to be a writer, because I get asked that all the time. You know, how did you know that you wanted to write? And I actually can trace it to one particular teacher who I hated. I was fourth grade, and we came back after summer vacation, and she said, you know, write what you did over summer vacation, which is the worst assignment ever. And so I chose to write from the point of view of the piano that I had been practicing on. I got it back the next day, and I got an F. And she said, I didn't ask for a creative writing assignment. Well, to be fair, she did not ask for one either. So my mom marched into the school, got me transferred out of her class, and I wound up after that with a bunch of teachers who knew I liked to write and really encouraged me to do it. So much so that when I went off to college, I really wanted to study at a real creative writing program with living, breathing authors. And in the 1980s, there weren't nearly as many as there are now. I was fortunate enough to be accepted at Princeton, and like every other creative writing student, I was told, write what you know. Didn't take me long to figure out I knew absolutely nothing. I had grown up in the suburbs. My parents are still happily married. I have a little brother and I like him. You know, I didn't have enough anguish in my life to be a writer. I remember, this is a true story, I called my mother and I asked if maybe there was a little incest or domestic abuse I didn't know about. But no. So instead of writing what I knew, I decided that I was going to write what I was willing to learn. And if you look up fiction in the dictionary in Webster's, it's defined as something invented by the imagination or feigned. We know that it covers genres like science fiction with worlds that don't exist and genres like romance with men that don't exist. But you know, I've been writing now for about 25 years. I write fiction, but I have never just sat down at my desk and winged it. I don't make things up. Sometimes I spend more time doing research than I actually do physically writing a first draft. Why? Why would I bother? Well, because fiction's a tightrope. It's my job to whisk you away from your lives and your everyday activities. But in order to do that, I need to create characters and situations that are so real that I get you to come along in the first place. So I have done some truly amazing things in the pursuit of research over my time as a writer. I have observed open heart surgery. I've learned how to speak Lakota Sioux. I've been to jail. I did get to leave, but I've been to jail. I've hung out on movie sets. I've shadowed police chiefs. I've lived with the Amish. I've been to death row. I've hunted for ghosts. I've studied witchcraft. You name it, I've done it. And if I haven't, I'm sure I'm going to get to it sooner or later. And so today what I'm going to be talking about is Small Great Things, which is my most recent novel, and about some of the research behind it, and perhaps more importantly, why this book really was the book that changed my life as a person, not just a writer. Small Great Things is about racism in America. 20 years ago, I tried to write about racism. I was living in New York City, and there was this actually happened, a real life story in the news about an African American undercover cop who was shot 4 times in the back by white colleagues, even though he had this wristband that said it was a color, and it was called the color of the day, which is how undercover cops identify each other. So I started a book that was based off this incident, and I failed miserably. I could not seem to create authentic characters, authentic situations, authentic dialogue. And eventually I took the book and I put it aside. The truth is, I didn't know whether I had the right to write that story. Very clearly, I am a white woman. Is it my right and is it my job to write about racism when I haven't lived like a person of color has in this country? Well, like I said, I went on to other books, but every now and then I would keep coming back to this manuscript, and I would play devil's advocate with myself, and I would say, okay, you know, you write all the time in the points of view of people you're not. You write as school shooters, as Holocaust survivors, as rape victims. You've never been any of those, so why is this different? Because race is different. Racism is different. It's really hard to talk about without offending people, and so as a result, we often just don't talk about it at all. Fast forward to 2012, to Flint, Michigan. Again, this is another real-life story from the news that I read. An African-American nurse with 20 years of labor and delivery experience helped deliver a baby, and in the aftermath, the baby's father called in her supervisor, and he said to her, "I don't want her or anyone who looks like her to touch my kid." And he pushed up his sleeve to reveal a swastika tattoo. He was a white supremacist. In their infinite wisdom, the hospital put a Post-it note in the baby's file saying, "No African American personnel to touch this infant." The nurse wound up banding together with some other colleagues of color, and they sued the hospital, and I hope she got a giant payout. But it made me wonder, what if? What if that nurse was the only one alone with the baby when something went terribly wrong? What if she had to choose between obeying her supervisor's orders to not touch the baby or saving the baby's life? What if, as a result, she wound up on trial, defended by a white public defender who, like me, like a lot of my friends, would never consider herself to be a racist? What if I could tell the story in 3 alternating narrative voices, the African-American nurse, the white public defender, and the white supremacist father, as they all began to unpack their beliefs about power and privilege and race, and suddenly I knew I was going to be able to finish this book. And here's what was different. I wasn't writing this book to tell people of color what their lives are like. That's not my right, it's not my role, and to be honest, there are amazing writers of color doing that every day and doing a fantastic job of it. I was writing this book to people who look like me, people with light skin, people who can very easily point to a white supremacist and say, "That's a racist," but can't point to themselves and say the same thing. As I said before, this was the hardest book that I have ever written. I couldn't ask all my readers to confront their biases if I hadn't done it myself. And I didn't even have a vocabulary to start with. So I began by doing a lot of research. I read everything I could by social justice educators, racial justice educators, and I read a lot of history about race. As Debbie Irving, a social justice educator, says, race is called a pigment of the imagination. It can't be identified by DNA. In fact, we often have more in common with people from different races than we do with our own. And here's a little history of the term white, in case you want to know where that came from. It's legal. It's a legal term from legal documents. In 1619, the first 20 Africans were brought to the United States on a Dutch ship. In 1641, 3 servants ran away. 2 of them, a Dutchman and a Scotsman, were given an extra year of servitude as a punishment. One of them, a black man named John Punch, was given to his master to serve his entire life. That was the first instance of slavery in the United States. In 1675, Bacon's Rebellion happened. Nathaniel Bacon was a black man who couldn't get land in Virginia, so he organized some Africans and Europeans to band together and to burn down Jamestown. He was lynched as a result. In 1680, the House of Burgesses got smart, and they responded to the rebellion by trying to divide factions against each other so that those Europeans and those Africans couldn't band together and work, which led to 1691 and the word white being used for the first time. And this is the context in which it showed up. Anyone of English or white descent who intermarries with a black will be banished. In 1705, indentured servants were Christians, and they were given food, land, guns, and money. They couldn't be whipped in public, and they could sue their masters if they were mistreated. Non-Christian servants, Africans, were to be enslaved. They were not to be given land, cattle, or guns, and they could not lift a hand to a white person. This was all in legal documents, and this was the beginning of organized slavery in America. When I finished doing the historical research for this book, I decided to enroll in a racial justice workshop. And I thought, honestly, how bad could this be? I'm a nice person, right? And I gotta tell you, I left there every single night in tears. And it was mostly because of the stories that I was hearing. Like the Asian American woman who was crying over the internalized oppression of her features, in particular, how they related to eyeliner. Eyeliner, she said, was the standard of beauty in the United States, but she couldn't put it on easily, and that was a struggle for her every single day. The African American woman who stood up and said that every morning when she leaves the house, she has to put on a metaphorical mask so that she can be the kind of black woman other people can handle. When I finished this workshop, I gathered together a group of women, black women who came from all different walks of life, all different ages, who overlooked my ignorance at understanding how they had grown up, and who were willing to share with me their hopes and their fears and their failures and their successes, and yeah, their stories. So there was the girl who had just graduated from Vassar College up in Poughkeepsie, great school, who was now working in New York City. And when she went on the trains and the subway, she always took her Vassar water bottle with her, so that when she sat down, she could turn the word Vassar out toward the aisle, so that, as she said, as white people walked by, they would know she was safe to sit with. There was the new mom who came to me the day after the shooting of yet another unarmed African-American man by the police. She had her adorable baby on her hip, and she was frantic. And she came in saying, how do I do it? How do I keep my son safe when he grows up? How do I teach him to not be black? How do you answer that? There was a woman who said to me, just in conversation, how often do you talk to your kids about racism? And I said, when something happens on the news. And she was shocked. She said, I talk about it every night. It's a matter of life or death. And that was when I began to realize that ignorance is a privilege too. However, it isn't just the voice of African American women that I had to channel for this book. And I should also say that these women all read the book in manuscript form, vetted the voice of Ruth, and helped me make her sound authentic. And I would not have written it without their help, and I couldn't have written it without their help. But I had to create another voice that was very different from me as well, and that was the voice of a white supremacist. So I also met with two former skinheads, and I'm going to tell you about them now. Tim Zoll is a man who grew up in Orange County, California, in a very privileged home, and he began running with a white supremacist gang. And one night, he and his buddies went out wilding, as they called it, and they beat up a gay man, slammed his head into the curb, and left him to die in the street. Years later, Tim got out of the movement. And one of the first things he did was write a letter to the rabbi at the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles, because at some point in his heyday, he had written the man a very offensive note and he wanted to apologize. The rabbi did something unexpected. He said, why don't you come work for me? And so Tim did. He went to the Simon Wiesenthal Center, and every day he would stand up and he would give a talk about living a life of hate. One day he was in the cafeteria and he looked up and there was a tour group coming through that was being led by a tour leader, and the leader met his gaze and he realized this was the man that he had beaten up and left to die in the street. Over a period of months, they sat down, there were apologies, there was forgiveness, they consider themselves friends now, they celebrate holidays at each other's houses, and every day they stand up together and they tell their story to groups, to school groups. The second man I met with is a man named Frankie Mink. Frankie ran a very violent skinhead gang in Philadelphia. Like many people who run violent skinhead gangs, he was sent to jail. In jail, the weirdest thing happened. He realized he had more in common with the young African American kids than he did with the white kids. For example, he would go to Bible study with them, or he would sit and talk about the girls that he missed on the outside, the food that they missed on the outside. When he left jail, his first job was to work for a Jewish man. Now, he had been told his whole life that Jews will cheat you out of your money. So he was not surprised when, the night before his contract ended, his boss called him into the office. And he thought, here it comes, he's gonna stiff me, I'm not gonna get my money. And instead, his boss said, Frankie, you've done such an exemplary job, I'd actually like to pay you double what I contracted you for. And Frankie began to wonder, how many exceptions to the rule do there have to be before maybe you have to change the rules? Both of these men now actively work with the government to ferret out white supremacists. And they told me that white supremacy really has changed a lot since the heyday in the 1980s. No longer are skinheads wearing combat boots and shaving their heads. They actually look like you and me. They spend most of their time stockpiling weapons in rural areas for what they believe is the coming racial holy war. And instead of running around beating people up, they spend most of their time online creating fear and hate by posting on social media. They may also go into a community and make it look like there are more of them than there actually are. For example, they'll go into a temple parking lot at Friday night services, and they will put the final call from the Nation of Islam underneath the windshield wipers of all the cars and get everyone all freaked out. They also told me that in the wake of the 2016 election, there has been a rise of recruitment in white supremacists through these groups. They go onto college campuses, and what they'll do is put up a poster that says something that is anti-black, anti-gay, anti-Muslim, and then they stand on campus and they wait for the reaction. They wait for the people who say, you know, that's horrible, and then more importantly, they wait for the kids who say, I just wish we didn't all have to be so politically correct, and they pounce on them and they wind up indoctrinating them. You can today still celebrate Aryan Independence Day in the spring, Hitler's birthday in the spring, or Aryan Independence Day in July, by going to their festivals. They happen in places like where I live, in New Hampshire, in rural areas. Usually it's an unmarked, big, muddy field. You can park your car, listen to a white power band, you can get a tattoo. You can bring your kids, because there are kiddie games, like Pin the Star on the Jew. Or they have piñatas, but the piñata is an African-American man hanging from a noose. There are target shooting booths, and the targets are pictures of Martin Luther King Jr. and President Obama. It is 2018, and those materials are being made in our country for the use of these groups. I learned a lot researching this book and writing this book. I learned that just because you don't talk about racism doesn't mean that you are not part of the problem. People don't like to say I'm a racist because they think racism equals prejudice, but it doesn't. Racism is prejudice plus power. And who has all the power in this country? White people. The way I can prove this to you is, let's say you took every skinhead and put them on a rocket ship and sent them off to Mars. Would there still be racism in America? Yeah. Why? Because racism is systemic and institutional. And yet, it's both enhanced and dismantled in individual acts. So the way I like to think about it is like those moving walkways, you know, at the airport. So a white supremacist is the guy who gets on the walkway with his bag and starts walking and gets to the other side really fast. If you step on with your bag and you just stand there, you're gonna get to the same side. It's just gonna take you a little longer. If you want to be actively anti-racist, you have to turn around and start running in the opposite direction. Now, it's really easy, I think, for white people to understand that there are headwinds of racism, right? We kind of know that if you're a person of color in America, things may come a little more difficult to you. It's very hard, though, for us to see the tailwinds of racism, to acknowledge that if we succeed, that if something comes to us, it's not because of luck or hard work. It could be because we got something a person of color did not. It's really hard to wrap our heads around that idea of privilege. But for example, maybe you got an apartment because your landlord didn't want to rent to a person of color. Now, you may never have known that, but you still got the apartment. Or maybe you went to a great college and you tell yourself, well, it's because I studied really hard and I did well on my SATs. Absolutely. But maybe also you had parents who were home at night to read to you and to instill the value of education. And a person of color might have had parents who were working multiple jobs who didn't do that, and so they were always playing catch up in the educational system. When you begin to see the world this way, the American dream doesn't look quite so dreamy. Why did I write this as a novel, given all this research that I did? Well, because I was in that boat. I knew what it was like to want to have a conversation about racism as a white person, but not even have the vocabulary to do it. And sometimes it's also really hard to walk up to someone and say, let's talk about race. Chances are they're going to turn around and run away from you. If you really want to have that kind of conversation, sometimes the best way to do it is to go see a movie with someone or to read a book with someone and then to be like, yeah, you know when that happened in Black Panther? Actually, that reminded me of something I saw in the news. And then you wind up having a very honest conversation about race. I know how hard it is to find the right words, and hopefully my novel can give you that springboard, can give you the words that you need to start talking, because we do have to start talking. And if you do read the book, I can tell you what's going to happen. You're going to say, yes, Jodi, you're so right. What do I do? How do I make changes in my life? Now, I am not a social justice educator. I'm not a racial justice educator. I can just tell you what worked for me and hope that you can maybe apply some of it to your own situation. So I am going to take you to church today on this Sunday and tell you how to be anti-racist right now. So first I'm going to actually start by telling you what not to do. Because often when we talk about racism, we get it wrong. So here's the first thing you should not do. Do not say, I'm colorblind. I know what you mean when you say you're colorblind, but what a person of color hears is, you don't even care enough to acknowledge the truth that my life was different from yours. What you really mean is you're color aware. So say that instead. Don't say, if you're talking in particular to a person of color, don't say, oh, I totally get it, I'm a minority too. I'm gay, I'm Jewish, I'm female, whatever. That's great. If you are, that's awesome, because it gives you a point of empathy from which you can begin to understand perhaps the way they have lived their whole life. But if you're talking to a person of color and you come back immediately with that, you have robbed them of the narrative. You have not given them a chance to tell you what their lives have been like. Don't ever say, I have black friends, okay? When you say that, first of all, it assumes that one or two people are representative of the group. You wouldn't want to be treated that way, so don't treat other people that way. Also, here's a newsflash. If you do have black friends and you haven't actually sat down and had a heart-to-heart talk about racism and the role of white people in it, you do not really have black friends. Don't assume that you have to be present at all conversations about race. White people are used to that. We're used to having a microphone. We're used to someone showing up to listen to us. And we're used to going into a community to save things and to be fixers. But you know what? Communities of color have their own leaders and their own plans. So if you really want to help, go in not as a savior, but as a helper. Go in and say, hi, I'm here. Do you need my help? You do? Great. What would you like me to do? In other words, really, it's not about you. And this is probably the most important one, the last don't. Do not say all lives matter. And let me tell you why. Okay, we know all lives matter, but I'm going to put it in a different frame for you. Let's say you break your arm and you go to the doctor and your arm is killing you and you want him to put it in a cast and he goes, but all bones matter. You're going to be really angry that he didn't give you a cast. We know right now that if you are African American and living in this country, your chance of living to a ripe old age are a lot less than a white person. All lives cannot matter until black lives matter more, which is why we say that. So, now that I have paralyzed you with fear and told you what not to do, let me tell you what you can do if you want to start making differences in your own life. So first of all, you need to know the difference between equal and equitable. Equal means the same and equitable means fair. Let's say you guys were teachers and you had a blind student in your class. You would not give her the same test as every other kid in your class, right? What you would do is give her a test that's in Braille with the same information. That's what we mean when we talk about equal and equitable. What you need to do is recognize that because of systems and institutions, there are many different starting points for people in this world, that someone is not always entering the starting gate at the same place. So no matter what walk of life you're in, make sure that there are paths to success for everyone, so that everyone has that same chance to make it to the finish line. Second, educate yourself. It's not on people of color to tell us about their histories, their lives, any of that. It's on us to learn it. So we're going to do a little quiz right now. I would like you to raise your hands if you know who Rosa Parks is, right? Awesome. Now I want you to raise your hand if you, oh, thank you. Hi everyone. I want you to raise your hand if you know who Lewis Latimer is. Okay, I see a couple people, good for you. How about Garrett Morgan? All right, that's good. We know some people who know that. If you didn't know the answers to that, you all have homework right now. You need to go home. You need to look up those gentlemen who invented things that you use every single day. And then I want you to ask yourself, why wasn't I taught that in elementary school? Because that's a really good question to ask. Next, make yourself feel uneasy. If it's possible for you to go to a place where this is not the predominant color in the room, do it. It's going to make you feel really weird because we're used to walking around if we're white and seeing everyone look like us. It's great. If you feel uneasy, that's actually your leading edge. It means that you are starting to understand something. So go with it. Notice your tailwinds. What I mean by this is often I get mail from people who've read this book and say, don't you call me a racist. I am not a racist. I didn't ask to be born white. Now, I didn't ask to be born white either. The question is, once you open your mind to this way of looking at the world, once you recognize that you may have privileges because you have light skin, what are you going to do with them? So notice those tailwinds. When you go to Easter dinner and you have, racist Uncle Joe makes a horrible off-color joke, instead of just turning away and pretending you didn't hear it, call him out on it. Now, you may not change his mind, but maybe you're the first time that anyone has ever said anything that made him think twice. If you are in a board meeting and it's mostly a bunch of old white guys doing the talking, raise your hand and say, we haven't heard from Jess over there yet. I'd love to hear from Jess, and maybe Jess is a woman of color. Sometimes the best thing that you can do with that privilege is make sure that other people are noticed and heard. Which leads me to the next idea, which is to talk to people who look like you. That's the role of the ally for white people. We need to talk about racism when we're together. We need to talk about racism even when there aren't any people of color around us. And how do you do that? A million different ways. If you have a second grader, walk into your second grader's classroom and say to the teacher, hey, I'm just wondering, what are we doing this year to learn about Black history? Is it just going to be about slavery, or are there maybe some heroes and inventors that we can model for the kids so that they get to learn about that too? Even better if you're a white mom and you're asking that stuff. That's awesome. Talk even when you make a mistake. I still make mistakes. A lot of people make mistakes. It is so much more important for us to talk, to acknowledge if we've made a mistake, say, thank you for telling me that, I didn't realize that, I've learned from that, and to move forward, than to just sweep it under the carpet and pretend that racism no longer exists in this country. And here is the one thing that you can all do today. Go home, look at your bookshelf, and read. Ask yourself, are you reading an author of color in direct proportion to every white author you read? If not, why not? First of all, you're missing out on some really awesome literature. But second of all, you are also only going to grow as a person intellectually if you begin to stretch your mind a little and read people who are different from you, who've lived differently from you, who think differently from you. So I urge you to go pick up books by people like Colson Whitehead, Octavia Butler, Jason Reynolds, Toni Morrison, Danielle Clayton, Nick Stone, Amy Tan, Jacqueline Woodson, Celeste Ng, Ta-Nehisi Coates. There are millions of authors out there with amazing, rich voices, and if you haven't experienced them yet, boy, do you have a treat. A really great little mnemonic device that I take with me that I learned, I stole from a Black activist on Twitter, and it's the word ally. A, always center the impacted. In other words, just remember, it's not about you. L, listen and learn from the people who live in the oppression. That's what really moved me. It was hearing the stories of all of these people, and I hadn't really been listening that carefully before. L, leverage your privilege. Sometimes the best thing you can do as a white person is this. Are you listening? Can you hear me? Great, which leads to Y, yield the microphone. Amplify the voice of someone who's not normally heard as often as you are, and make sure that that voice becomes more common. So I'm going to leave you with two little bits of hope. The first is a bit of research that I discovered while I was doing the research for Small Great Things, which is that the same structures in the brain that allow us to hate people we don't know are exactly the same structures that allow us to feel compassion for people that we don't know. So what does that mean? If you go out and commit a hate crime, a certain part of your brain lights up. The same exact part of your brain lights up if you decide to donate money to the family of an African-American boy who was shot by police by accident, even though you will never meet them and they will never meet you, which really does tell me that love is the flip side of hate. And the last little bit that I'm going to leave you with is a local tidbit that I'm sure many of you know about. Here in Savannah, the local Girl Scouts have asked state lawmakers to change the name of the Eugene Tallmadge Bridge. Right? If you don't know, Eugene Tallmadge was a former Georgia governor who supported white-only primary elections, who rallied against people who supported desegregation at state universities, and who once said, and I quote, that a black man's place was at the back door with his hat in his hand. The Girl Scouts came into the government armed with Thin Mints, but apparently the legislature is still saying no. The reason I want to bring this up is because I know how hard it is and how overwhelming it is to think that a person, little old me or little old you, can move the needle against racism. Because it's systemic, and because it's institutional, and because it's so deeply ingrained, it sometimes feels like you're pushing against a brick wall. But here's the amazing thing. Systems and institutions are made up of people, which means it's possible. And for that, I'm going to leave you with the words of 11-year-old Sawyer Stewart, a Girl Scout. No is not a boundary. I can reach the sky, and if you say no, that just wants me to try harder. Thanks. Great.
Thank you so much.
Sure, of course.
So, a couple of things. First off, I wanted to give Jodi this symbol of our city and also of our dedication to your presence here. Flannery O'Connor is a Savannah writer, as you all know. She also drew cartoons, and this is a book of her cartoons from us to you in tribute to your coming here for us
Thank
today.
you so much. That's really lovely.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So,
I mean, you learn something new every day about Flannery O'Connor, right?
exactly. So we're gonna start with the question and answer session. Now, if you can bring the lights up, a couple of things. I wanted to start while they're getting the microphones down here with one question. You know, one of the things that you talked about, you know, obviously the racism at the center of this whole discussion and the center of this book. One of the things that I've always felt that racism was something that was born out of ignorance. I mean, basically, that you know, that's the genesis of it generally. And yet we live in a society nowadays where it's increasingly polarized, where people seem to be, there's not a lot of intelligent discourse. There's this is my way or the highway. If you're not like me, you're against me, that sort of thing. And you and I were talking backstage about how social media has changed the publishing industry.
Right.
And I've got a theory that social media may be changing our perceptions of each other as well. I'd see if you can comment on that in the context of your discussion here.
Yeah, so social media has brought us all incredibly close and also very far away, because you can push a button and send some horrible comment to someone without even being personally accountable when you're not face to face. What I will say is that most people are, the things that I've seen happen with this book that have been the most remarkable come from book clubs, either of white people who suddenly realized, why are we all white? And maybe invited someone to come who's a person of color to talk to them, which, I mean, hats off to the person of color willing to do that, but it also created some really incredible conversations, I think. I think that, for me, social media is really important because it is a way to reach out sometimes and to find people and groups that you may not normally have in your sphere. Don't stay in your bubble. Social media creates a bubble, and it's really important to reach out. If you really want to learn more about what it's like to be a person of color, for example, go follow Black Twitter. There are some crazy, fantastic activists on Twitter who I love to listen to, and I love to hear their point of view. It might surprise you to realize that you feel very much like they do.
Thank you. So questions from the audience? So we've got a bunch. Down here.
So I love the book.
Thank
and
you.
one of my favorite parts was actually your author's note at the end. And in it you wrote, I expect pushback from this book. I will have people of color challenging me for choosing a topic that doesn't belong to me. I will have white people challenging me for calling them out on their racism. So I'm wondering, did you get the pushback you expected, and did any of it ring true enough that if you could go back, you would have changed anything?
It's a great question, and I will tell you that half of it came true. I have not had a single comment from an African American telling me that I should not have written this book. In fact, I was overwhelmed with the graciousness of people of color who read the book and who said, they would all write me and say, this is great and this is my life. And let me tell you about a microaggression that I just experienced. So I'll tell you one, because I get them every day from readers who write me. There was a woman who was a sign language interpreter, and she's an African-American woman, and she was at a predominantly white church, and she was sitting, I guess, she was sitting in the front. There was an old woman who she was signing for, and as you can tell, I am not a sign language interpreter, and this woman who was also, who was quite deaf, basically said very loudly in the middle of the sermon and in the middle of her signing, make her stop, I can't look at her black face anymore. This woman had to finish her job, go out, come back the next day, because that's her job. And I could give you 50 examples of those. I mean, countless people wrote to me to explain what they see on a daily basis, what they experience on a daily basis. So I really did not get the pushback from the African-American community that I expected. I've had all fantastic Black book groups who've been like, wow, I can't believe a white person is actually finally saying this, which is really nice to hear and very gracious. I just wish it hadn't taken me so long to say it. What I do get constantly is pushback from white people. Mostly a lot of older men and women who, again, say to me, how dare you call me a racist? You don't know anything about me. I have Black friends. Literally every single email has that in it. And, and I just go, okay, some people just aren't willing to hear it yet. Yeah, and that's the truth. You will be able to reach some people, you will not be able to reach others. It is just my hope that, the more people that begin talking about this, that begin acknowledging, that it's an issue that we white people have to address, to fix, perhaps eventually they'll come aboard. But I mean, I'm not going to do it myself, but I'm always happy to be the first one to try.
Is there one down here? Oh, there you go, right there in the middle.
I just want to say I love your books.
Thank you.
I really love this book in general. Have you ever thought about writing from another person's perspective, like a gay person or someone who's not black or transgender or something like that?
I have. I do, all the time. I did write from the point of view of a lesbian in Sing You Home, for example. Like I said, I've written from the point of view of school shooters, from the point of view of men. I mean, lots of things that I'm never going to be. And I have plans to examine things about transgender issues coming up. It'll be down the pike a little bit. But that's never scared me before. But the difference with racism is wrapped up in publishing and with something called Own Voices. That is a movement that's been happening alongside the We Need Diverse books. It's really about representation and about the fact that it is harder to get published as a person of color than it is as a white person. So imagine how dispiriting it would be if you were a black author and were trying to get published and some white girl comes along and writes a story about, your history. You can see how frustrating that would be, right? So you don't want to be the white person who takes that away, which is why, for me, I couldn't write that first book I told you about, but I could write the second because if you read Small Great Things, you will realize that you're hearing Ruth's story, the African-American nurse, but you are following Kennedy's path. Kennedy is the well-meaning white woman who thinks, I'm not a racist, I'm a nice person, I'm a public defender, I spend most of my time defending people of color. I mean, what more could I possibly do? And then she realizes over the course of the book, there's a lot she could do. So, there was a very different intent and audience that I was looking toward when I was writing Small Great Things. But even so, right now I have a book that's coming out in October that has a whole posse of characters of color, white and black people are in it. And because I want to make sure it rings true, it's out with sensitivity readers who are African-American women that are authors themselves who are reading the book to make sure that I'm not saying something that wouldn't ring true in some way. Because if I'm going to do it, if I'm going to write a black character, and I do want to people my worlds, my fictional worlds, with all colors, all types, all genders, all sexual orientations, I'm going to make sure that I am not making up that story. There are people who live it every day, so you want to make sure that you're getting it right. It's just another form of research.
Thank you.
Hi. I apologize for breaking the rules. I've got two questions. It's the last day. One of them is very short. I know you mentioned a couple of when we were raising our hand, we know who Rosa Parks was, and then you mentioned Louis Lattimore, I think was another
Louis Latimer and Garrett Morgan.
And Garrett Morgan. Okay.
Yes.
So will you write that down for me?
Yes,
my friend?
everyone
Thank
put
you.
that in their phones, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the second question is, for those of us who would like to see the Tallmadge Bridge changed, and it comes up in conversation, how do we then answer back when somebody says, look, and it could be a Confederate statue or whatever, it's part of history, why do we have to change it? Why do we have to be so politically correct? What do we say next to get beyond that statement, which seems to stop the conversation?
Yep. That's a great question, and I am really blessed to live in the North where we don't have it as often as you guys do. But honestly, I think it's about, like I said, when you begin to lock horns with someone over racism, when they say it's part of our history, I mean, I would personally say, I can't imagine what it would feel like, for example, to be a Jewish person now living in Germany with statues of leaders of the Third Reich. They don't have that in Germany. So I'm confused as to why that should still be part of history, frankly. But I'm coming at it from a very different perspective because I'm not a Southerner. What I will say is that I encourage in that situation you to step back from the reality of it and instead, like I said, find a movie. There's a great movie called 13th that was a documentary done by Ava DuVernay, which is all about the 13th Amendment. and see if you can watch a movie, read a book, do something that is a little less in your face. There's something about fiction and movies that just feels kinder and gentler because it's not real, you know? And you can have a conversation that isn't quite as charged as, why are we not knocking this down right now in my front yard? That's the best I can suggest. The other thing is, you're gonna have to realize there are some people whose minds you are not gonna change. That they're just not ready to hear it yet. And that's okay. Turn to somebody else and say, what do you feel about this? Because if you can rally other people in your community, then maybe they might be the one who makes the difference. I mean, eventually, if it's, if it's 1 against 1, it's hard. If it's 50 against 1, it becomes, the dynamics change a little bit.
I'm looking for questions in the balcony. If there are any out there, I don't see any. Oh, do we have somebody? You got some up there? Okay, good. So, there are people in the balcony.
I see them, yeah.
That are waving their
They're
hands.
waving
Thank you,
and yeah.
Mark.
Very vigorously. They look tiny up there.
Quick question. You know that's probably not possible for me, but I'll do my best.
Oh, wait a second. We have 2 questions going at once. Hold on. Who's going first? Balcony. Okay. Sorry, sir. Hang on a second. Balcony, hit
Hello,
us with your
Jodi.
question.
It's so good to see you. I have read all 24 books, and I'm just in love with your writing. I'm asking about your craft.
Yep.
The way that you have different perspectives and points of view in all of your books, which
Yeah.
we love so much as your readers. I'm wondering, do you take one on a journey all the way through the story, or do you keep going as you go and switch back and forth?
No, so I write the book exactly in the order that you see it, exactly in that order. And the way I've always kind of thought about it is, for me, it's a little bit like stepping into a stream. And the stream is the narrative, it's the chronology, it's what's keeping the story moving. But on the edge of the stream are like 5 different pairs of Wellington boots. And so when I'm writing a certain character, I put on those boots and I step into the stream and I'm catching it as it's coming by. But how it's gonna feel over my feet is going to depend on how those boots feel on me. And then if I choose another character's boots, it's gonna be a little bit different. That's the best way I can describe what it's like to write in multiple first-person narratives. I love doing it because it really keeps me on my toes. But I've never written a book the way that you're asking, where I just do one character all the way through and then another all the way through and then piece it together. The book that I have coming out in October is a technological nightmare. It was written, the entire chronology goes backward in time. So you imagine it takes place over an 8-hour day, and it starts at 6 p.m. and goes all the way back to that morning. And it is in the third person, but has about 9 different points of view woven through it. And so when I edited that book, I had my husband go out and buy me those tiny little tags, those Post-it tags, different colors. And I was like, I need like 16 different colors. And I marked up the entire manuscript and I edited forward. And then I edited each thread of just each character backward to make sure that the chronology held. And then I edited the whole thing backward again. It was crazy. Just when you read that, just, I don't know, raise a glass of wine to me somewhere. Yeah. So. All right, there was a gentleman down here, right?
One more
Okay.
question, I think.
Yep.
I don't know if you've read Steven Pinker's new book, Renaissance Now, and in it he proposes that the Renaissance continues and has made the world much better since its initiation. I've always thought something happened in France a long time ago. But he has charts that vividly display progress in the world. And one of his issues is that identity politics is deleterious to progress. So the race question is certainly huge, but it does cut both ways. And I admit to being a racist. I'm a human being. We're all tribal. But I try to reach out. I have in this festival in the past, and I appreciate your talk and the disclaimer at the beginning when I came out about inappropriate appropriation of other cultures.
Yeah.
So my daughter reminds me of that constantly.
It's good to have kids. They really do put you in your place. It's great. I learned a lot from my kids. In fact, when I went to that racial justice workshop that I told you about, I went with my son-in-law. He was still my future son-in-law at that moment. But he said, you know, I know what you're writing about, and I think you might really like this. And so every day I was on the T in Boston going home, blubbering in his arms because I was so moved by this workshop, and I really feel bad that he had to bear the brunt of all that. But you know, it is about discussion. I mean, let's be realistic. If you're here and you're white, aren't there times that you would much rather, I don't know, like carve out your eye with a teaspoon than have a discussion about race? It's a hard thing to talk about. It's a really hard thing to talk about. But here's what you need to know. When you don't talk about it, people of color hear that silence and think you don't care. And I know my community, I know us, and I know that many of us care deeply. So don't make that mistake. Have that hard conversation gently. Just make a tiny change in your life. Start with reading. Give a book to someone else. Watch a movie. Have a discussion with a teacher. Anything you can do in some small way is a step for the positive. Thanks.
Thank you.